So hello everyone, I'm really excited to be here with you today. It's still morning out here in New York, so bear with me while I let the caffeine do its work. This is the first time I'm presenting this particular research project, so I'm very excited to hear your feedback. Let me start with a little background. I've been wanting to do a study on trans members of far-right groups for years now, and I went back and forth on this project because it would distract from my dissertation, which is not so coincidentally about disrespectability politics, a sort of mirror image of the transgender conservatism that I'm going to talk to you about today. After being introduced to a few trans neo-fascists last year, I finally decided to embark on this whole project. And in the process, I narrowed down the topic to two main questions that we'll be talking about through the next, well, however long I have left. So the first question is asking why trans people adopt these far-right beliefs that seem to contradict their identities. And second, how we can prevent others from doing the same. So we'll be covering the alarming and quite frequently hilarious development of far-right identity among trans people. Right now, I'm going to discuss the development of the project and then move on to initial findings. And then we'll finish with some concluding questions for you. It's interesting doing these Zoom interviews because I'm used to a more collaborative process of like speaking with people rather than at folks. So bear with me here. The primary inquiries of this whole scope of the project have a long history in research and members of far-right groups, but once published, this will also be the first comprehensive study about trans people on the far-right. And I also want to clarify, I'm locating this study within interdisciplinary trans studies and political theory. However, it also relies on the work of historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and several other fields, although that's kind of far from my own background in trans studies, political philosophy, and feminist theory. We'll be talking about this a little more later on. We, of course, don't need any more hot psychological typologies of trans people. We've been through that, and thankfully, I think we're over it. So I'm, when I say these motivating factors, I'm referencing here political ideology rather than psychological or psychoanalytic drive. And more specifically, I'm locating the project within the realm of Dean Spade's concept of critical trans politics. Put simply, critical trans politics works past mere inclusion to a more revolutionary and critical future. This means that rather than simply attempting to liberalize, normalize, or include trans people who have far-right beliefs, I took up this methodology to conjecture ways of moving these groups or people with far-right inclinations toward the left. Now, it's long been established in countless studies on far-right ideological development that it's pretty much fruitless trying to change their minds. And it might actually reinforce their beliefs or identities as members of the far-right. That's why I focus here instead on how their ideological development may have been prevented in the first place. Of course, put into the interviewee's own words. So at first, when I started this research, I was expecting 3, maybe 5 individuals to respond to the call for participants. Within just a few weeks, I got over 60. This was a really surprising number, but it was exciting because I had a lot of material to work with. The interviews were a mix of surveys and then individualized questions carried out through email. Now, I know using email to conduct interviews is a controversial method, but I actually found it was very helpful for getting more honest answers out of the participants. Something unexpected that I ended up finding is that based on their own descriptions, many of them were uncomfortable speaking over the phone and were actually very adjusted to only writing their beliefs, but not vocalizing them out loud. Most of these participants knew their beliefs were unpopular, frankly, as they should be. So they would only speak of them in the online sphere. Now, before getting into findings, I should clarify the questions I asked. The participants come from a long history of research on interviews themselves. In particular, I followed the writings of feminist sociologist Kathleen Embley, who worked with women supporting Ku Klux Klan membership in Indiana. Most of these writers are in the United States, but actually quite a few are from, or based the research in continental Europe as well. I ended up speaking with Lee, and she helped me develop a written history technique for interviews, which follows themes she describes as evidence, empathy, and ethics. I know there's always a lot of questions about interviewing members of the far right, because I mean, most researchers are thankfully not aligned with them. So this means evidence, empathy, and ethics means I wouldn't take the interviewee's words at face value, but instead understand it as part of their beliefs. I didn't attempt to argue with them, no matter how conspiratorial, racist, or outright ridiculous what they said was. Of course, I'm also working through the scholarship of Michael Warner, Theodore Adorno, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Leslie Feinberg, Frantz Fanon, Claudia Kuntz, Lisa Dugan, and many other scholars who are doing some very interesting work on far-right groups. So these scholars help me really ground my methodology and line of questioning, because it is very complicated in how we're going to approach people with such reactionary and sometimes conflicting views. So here I should also add, in addition to the interviews, I also read through hundreds of books, articles, blog posts, social media groups, and other materials actually produced by members of the far right. This includes everything from a 17th century trans conquistador, and we might describe him now as a white supremacist serial killer, Antonio de Arauso, who wrote what's considered one of the first trans memoirs. I also read through dozens of far-right transgender forums, groups, and blogs, largely but not exclusively located in the United States. While doing this research and submerging myself in these politics, I also tried to reveal as little as possible about myself, because I'm a trans woman and a Jewish leftist, so my personal engagements had to be limited. But I was able to observe these groups and actually join some of them as kind of an observer participant. And so I was thankfully able to add these discussions in the groups to my results. So here we can get to the fun part, the findings. Now, we certainly don't need any more typologies of trans people. We've been through it. We're thankfully over it. So instead, I went with a flexible, imbricated category-based approach for understanding how these beliefs developed over time. I'm primarily here using their own words to describe these beliefs. So I found participants fell into 5 overlapping yet distinct categories of motivation. These included self-victimization, respectability, conspiracy, biopolitics, and belonging through exclusion. Each of these areas is considered distinct, basically if it wasn't entirely contained within another area. For example, many of the respondents cited self-victimizing behavior along conspiracy theories as the reason for being members of far-right groups. One respondent claimed they were oppressed for believing that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him by a Venezuelan voting machine conspiracy. Now, just doubling down on beliefs after being teased or bullied for voting for Trump would fall under self-victimization alone. And then believing in a vast conspiracy theory of Democrats or the deep state trying to sabotage Trump's election win is conspiratorial thinking alone. And these sort of commonality, or I found links and commonalities between these different categories, but each one had a certain distinction between it. At this point, I think, well, I hope you get it. The first and most prominent motivation was indeed self-victimization, where we can also describe this action as indirect bigotry or defensive bigotry. And I'm sure we've all heard of this before, especially like against immigrants, against trans people in restrooms, or trans women trying to participate in sports. And this is a somewhat Western, particularly North American form of far-right belief, but we do see it, of course, globally too. It's constructing harm where there is none. And this is frankly one of the most effective tools of the far right today. This manifested in two distinct but related forms around the interviewees. The first form focused outward. For example, several participants cited an immigration crisis as to the reason for being conservative. They believed that their livelihoods were at stake because of a supposed influx of immigrants coming into the country. I'm sure many of you have heard this before. And the second related piece of this theme was reiterated to me actually by almost every interviewee. And this went along the line of reasoning of, I'm more impressed for being conservative than being transgender. Of course, this is ridiculous, but they did seem to genuinely believe this. They would cite ousting from transgender community spaces for saying, frankly, some white supremacist bullshit, and then engage themselves in the sort of underdog politics of being oppressed as a conservative. So they reinforce their beliefs in the process. And this is why it's actually so difficult to repoliticize the far right. Anything you say will be seen as an attack, not only on their politics, but also on their very being as people. In terms of preventing self-victimization here, many of the participants would cite cases of trans conservatives being maligned, or immigrants, for example, committing crimes. And based on their experiences, these were key points of their politicization. And here it becomes apparent that presenting them with actual empirical data from sources they trust might have prevented them from engaging in far-right politics in the first place. But of course, this would all depend on the individual case. So second, we can turn to respectability, a personal favorite of mine. Respectability is, simply put, a moralistic appeal to authority. It was coined by, well, in its modern sense, by Harvard historian Evelyn Higginbotham. Now, I'm writing a whole dissertation on respectability politics, so it won't drag you into this too far. Many of the members did find that the trans movement, at least according to them, went too far, or was too aligned with leftist groups. One group of trans conservatives I worked with lamented about the alphabet soup mafia, quote unquote, who were, according to them, making them look bad by non-traditional aesthetics and controversial or leftist political beliefs. Now, of course, this aspect ties into self-victimization, but it does find a very distinct measure of politicization. Interestingly, quite a few of them actually didn't like the label trans or transgender to describe themselves. One said to me, "I'm not trans, I'm American." And that really stuck with me. Yeah, I see you laughing there. I am too, on the inside and occasionally the outside. So other participants preferred the term transsexual because they believed that they were afflicted by some inescapable condition of transness. They wanted to show that this was an aspect of their biology that they didn't wish upon themselves and won't wish upon anyone else, which they, some of them actually believed that like leftists were going into schools and indoctrinating children and turning them trans. The same sort of bullshit you'd hear on like a far right media outlet. Several unfortunately told me they actually wouldn't be trans given the choice, which I also find kind of heartbreaking. We can then turn to artist activist Tourmaline's concept of disrespectability, proving that we can become empowered by rejecting a moralistic appeasing of authorities in favor of community-led solutions. We can look at how actions such as mutual aid programs can open new possibilities for trans existence, quelling the fears from the trans right that they would be further violated for controversial beliefs or existence. Many of the interviewees cited just wanting to be respected or left alone as their motivation for joining far-right groups. Given new opportunities to exist in the world through mutual aid and social support, for example, would have prevented these beliefs in the first place. Next up, there was the, what at least some of them are calling the black pill or conspiratorial thinking. Many of the interviewees were self-described black pillars, which, if you're not familiar, is a reference to the Matrix film series Blue Pill, Red Pill Awakening scene, also created by two trans women, may I add. the cons of the black pill comes from incel and alt-right forums where participants developed a kind of defeatist view of the world. In the interviewees' use, many believe that a non-existent liberal or sometimes anti-fascist New World Order was controlling everything that they did, everything published in the media. This is essentially the deep state conspiracy, or a new version of the Jewish plot, as one of the authors I'm working with describes. Many were QAnon believers here in the United States. One actually told me that she believed Q of QAnon was a trans woman, reflecting a really fascinating self-identification with the conspiracy theory. Now, there's been a lot of literature already existing on deprogramming from cults and conspiracies. Most of these writers find that it takes time and repeated presence of some form of intersubjective truth to break it to them. Because again, this deeply ties into self-victimization and believing that the more pushback they get, the more they are victimized. And so relatedly, next up, we also have biopolitics. And I mean biopolitics both in the Foucauldian sense of the political relations of science, along with the contemporary function of societies of control. And this means creating norms that are deemed objective, rational, and scientific. In the interviewee's case, that means believing far-right ideologies will lead to a healthier, purer society. This is, of course, deeply related to eugenics and genocide. Now, it might sound funny that a group of trans people who are obviously so brutalized by eugenics would adopt it. However, after being so affected by these beliefs repeated over and over to us, it only makes sense that some members of our communities would take them up themselves. One of the first interviewees, who was also another Jewish trans woman, openly identified as eugenicist and transhumanist capitalist. She cited her own experiences as a trans woman, noting that she wanted to make society healthier through encouraging healthy individuals to reproduce, even citing her own surgery as a positive thing because she couldn't reproduce. Interestingly, she, along with several others who I interviewed, didn't necessarily identify as trans. They often identified as males or females who have transitioned, who have a disorder, who have a biological, inescapable medical condition. Many didn't believe they could actually change gender so much as ease suffering from dysphoria. Several align themselves with anti-transgender feminists who would then publicly argue against trans people participating in sports because of biological difference. They saw the leftists and liberals as anti-biological and ultimately harmful or unfair to society at large. Interestingly, some in the group who relied on biopolitics to justify their beliefs were among some of the most educated in the overall interviewee population. We might consider incorporating critical studies into, we might consider incorporating critical science studies into our education, or at least reading some goddamn Foucault was a preventative measure for these beliefs. And so finally, I want to take us to the last theme, which is belonging through exclusion. I took inspiration in this term from scholar Christina Beltran's writing on Latinx communities that were coming together through certain forms of violence, exclusion, and anti-immigrant sentiment. Many of the trans people I worked with found community through maligning, excluding, and violating leftists. Also Democrats or other trans people who they may not agree with. This feeling, being included, underscored their relationship with the far right, and they actually became highly involved with some trans on the right groups. Now, without getting too far into the US's contentious debate over free speech, we can see why deplatforming is so useful here. Without a platform to build community, these groups wouldn't be able to recruit new members, swiftly preventing belonging in the first place. And this also closely aligns with Beltran's concept of, well, sort of defeating this belonging through exclusion sentiment. So now that we've reviewed these motivations, I'm going to leave you with a few quick concluding concepts. First and foremost, it's evident one can't meet fascism with liberalism, even within our own communities. all of the interviewees were heavily bombarded with liberal messaging every single day, and it didn't work. Instead, we can turn to Spade's critical trans politics to provoke new ideas among those flirting with fascism. Many of these individuals were actually very tired of the liberal status quo, frankly, as they should be. Some weren't even exposed to leftist discourse that they could have adopted in place of these far-right beliefs. This is why it's so important to meet them where they're at with genuine politics and help them understand the violence of the right and promises of freedom. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.